College football nerds here doing a quick recap of the Alabama and Florida SEC championship game. And we want to touch a lot on the defensive performance for Alabama because I know a lot of you Bama fans have some concerns. And we're going to give you a not so fast and get a little bit nerdy with you on that. I've got Josh with me. Obviously, he is my co-host and he's going to help me get nerdy with y'all. I want to remind you, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Even you Florida fans who maybe haven't loved us throughout the year when we've gotten you wrong. We were pretty good on this one, and we're going to give you some kudos in this video, so hang around. All right, Josh, I want to start with the defense for Alabama. Obviously, there's tons of platitudes and lauding we can do with this Alabama offense. It's been done. And I don't think Alabama fans are concerned going into even a game against Clemson if they beat Notre Dame that their offense is going to put up points. What they're concerned with is they've seen a 48 from Ole Miss and a 46 from Florida, and they want to know what's going on. And one of the things we warned about going into that game and kind of got killed for from Alabama fans was, look, you've played a lot of bad offenses recently, and you've dominated them, which is great. But are there scaling issues within your defense when you play a team that can score points in buckets? I think we saw some of that. But Alabama fans, we're here to tell you that maybe it's not as bad as you're thinking. And Josh, I want you to kick us off with that. So just at a high level, tell me why maybe what we saw Saturday night is not such a scary thing for Alabama fans beyond the number that we saw on the scoreboard.
The thing that I cautioned a lot going into this game was that Alabama struggled early in the season with teams that were able to spread the field, create misdirection, and get isolation matchups. The past few weeks, Alabama was playing teams that were a little bit limited offensively. And the thing that makes Florida so dangerous and the thing that makes them one of the best offenses in the country, and I do believe absolutely one of the best offenses in the country, I'll say I'm pretty excited about the Oklahoma-Florida game to see how those two sort of shake up when I can put them on the same field. It's that Florida has a ton of weapons. And when you look down at the list of the guys that caught the ball in that game, Tony got 8 receptions, Pitts got 7 receptions, Trevon Grimes got 4, Naquan Wright got 3, Malik Davis out of the backfield got 2, and Jacob Copeland got 2. Grimes and Copeland would be starting for more than half SEC schools. Arkansas would kill for Grimes and Copeland. Tennessee would kill for Grimes and Copeland. And so the thing that really stresses a lot of teams is, when Alabama's on defense, and I lobbied for the fact that they needed to play Pitts as a receiver, not a tight end. I will say they did about 50-50 how they were going to do that. Most of the time, I think maybe 60-40, they played him as a tight end, particularly when he was in inline, and then when he split wide, then they kind of sort of played him as a receiver. But the reality is, you've got to put a corner on Grimes and a corner on Copeland. And they put them wide, and then they'd have Pitts and Tony in the slots. And that forced Alabama to frequently put, Jordan Battle or Malachi Moore one-on-one with Tony and Pitts. And it's just really, really difficult. So, we're going to get into this a bit. First, you got to accept, those are exceptional players, and exceptional players make plays. Now, there were some things Alabama did that weren't very good. Malachi Moore really missed his jam a couple times on Tony. One time on a little, sort of a stutter and around. He doesn't get his jam on Tony, and Tony beats him it was like a 50-yard touchdown pass. And he just gets burned because this is the scaling problem, right? Moore is very technically sound. He's been a very good fast twitch player in close space. This is the first guy he's faced that's able to run by him. And there's a reason he wasn't a 5-star, and a lot of that had to do with pure measurables. It's the same stuff that crops up when you start hyperanalyzing NFL draft picks. You played a veteran NFL caliber receiver, and you got burned. It happens, but it happens a lot more when you got guys in single coverage. And Daniel Wright, I think it was, couldn't get over and help him. So it all really compounds. And I'll say one more thing before I flip it back to you. I saw a lot of Alabama fans after the game and in our comments complaining, well, I don't understand why they didn't blitz more. Let's pause for a second, okay? Florida spent a lot of that game with empty sets, or they'd be 4 wide and they'd send the running back out in a pattern. if Florida has 5 wide receivers running downfield, you have to have 5 men covering them in man coverage. And Alabama rushed 4, so that's 9. That only leaves 2 other guys. So you only got a couple options. One guy you surely want to have at least one safety, okay? And the other guy, you either have some sort of short zone or safety, or you have 2 safeties. So Alabama, if they bring 5, is single man coverage with 1 safety. A lot of that game, they tried to keep 2 safeties back, or they tried to float the middle linebacker back to take away the RPO. There is literally no one left to blitz. And if you do try to blitz a slot player, which they did actually do some, that means you're now in cover 0, and you're hoping your safety doesn't get burned by Tony, and he probably will, and that happened. That's why Florida is extremely difficult. And the big difference to me when you look at Ole Miss versus Florida early in the season is Ole Miss, they just weren't in position. There would be nobody covering them. It'd be a wide open touchdown pass. That was the 2018 Clemson game. The guy's wide open. A DB falls down and he scores easy over and over again. In this Florida game, I mean, they matched up. They had a guy on a guy. It was just, Moses isn't fast enough to get on their super high-end running backs, which no one has been able to do this year. The safety can't cover Tony and Pitts, which no one is able to do and won't be able to do at the NFL level. A safety's not going to cover those guys. That's good on good, and I'm a lot less concerned about that than I am like an Ole Miss game where they made a lot of bad plays and alignment errors.
Yeah, I think the fears Alabama fans have is this 2018 Clemson all over again, and I don't think it is. Now, you might give up a boatload of points against Clemson just because even since then offenses have advanced a little bit, and they're going to get theirs. But as you said, the visual is Patrick Surtain being perfectly in phase, maybe losing a ball in the lights. I don't know what's going on there, but he could have intercepted that pass. Branch and Patrick Surtain perfectly covering Pitts, and on a 30-yard bomb that's a perfect pass where he's 6'6" and goes up and gets it, but they're both in perfect coverage, and you got pressure with a 3-man rush. That's the difference. 2018 Clemson, it was Savion Smith falling down, or I think Deontay Thompson looking in the backfield and getting beat over the top. They were very undisciplined, and they were thinking too much, and they were out of position. So it was, the way I said it to you before we started rolling was, I would feel a lot better if I got beaten by players than by scheme. And they got out-coached and out-schemed in 2018. And the concern is that's not fixable within a game. And that's not something like, good players are going to make plays, but at some point your good players can also make good plays. But if your good players are under-schemed and under-coached, then you can't make halftime adjustments for that. And Alabama didn't. And that's why almost every throw that Trevor Lawrence made, not every throw, and I don't want to denigrate what he did, but many of his downfield passes were wide open players, and they schemed that. And so I feel a little bit better if I'm an Alabama fan watching this game, knowing, look, Clemson doesn't have, and just real quick, is this fair to say Clemson does not have the offensive weapons, taking running back off the table, the offensive weapons to throw to that Florida has? What do you think?
I think that's totally fair, and some Clemson fans are going to watch this and get upset. You talk about Grimes, right? That played Surtain misses what might have been an interception. Grimes is the 3rd or 4th best receiver on that team. He is 6'4", 218 pounds. He will be drafted, and he's fast. He is where some of these young players on Clemson's team that have been banged up all year. They've got guys like Ladson that just have been too banged up to be effective this year, and Ngata. He is a veteran version of Ngata. And they're really where Clemson was hoping to be and aren't because they've had injury situations. But Amari Rodgers is a really good player. I think Tony is better. Galloway is a good tight end at Clemson. He's not on Pitts' level. In fact, I think Pitts, as a receiver, is Alshon Jeffrey. I was even have a conversation with you, like and message before and during the game. the more I looked at him, the more I think that guy might be Megatron level at the next level. His ceiling is exceptionally high. I think as a not as a tight end, but as an actual downfield receiver that is just guys that are 6'6" that actually run receiver speed are rare and they're exceptionally difficult to cover. Clemson's receiving core is good, but it's not what Florida's is. This Florida receiving core is a lot like what Clemson was a couple years ago when they had multiple first round picks.
Yeah, and I want to give Florida credit in this game. Like, their players made plays, and they earned every bit of those 46 points. I think it was 46. So that's part of it. And if you look at Ole Miss and A&M in particular, Alabama had really struggled with covering easy passes. And you go back to what you were saying, where Ole Miss, they didn't do a whole lot with their players. They were doing stuff that's wide open. They were hitting running backs out of the backfield like it was water. I mean, same thing with Texas A&M. They were hitting running backs. Nobody was covering them. And with Alabama, you're talking about having to go cover zero. When you go 5 wide empty and then you bring a guy back into the backfield or you run 4 wide with a running back, somebody's got to cover that guy. And Alabama took that away, and that's a big part of Florida's offense. Credit to Florida, because they adjusted, and they did a lot of stuff, especially in the second half, to adjust with Alabama taking it away. But what Alabama did defensively was force Florida and their players to really make plays. And instead of, like Texas A&M and like Ole Miss, where, I can dump it off in the flats to a running back and pick up 20 yards. That wasn't there. The pressure was there. And Josh, this is where I want to get into this a little bit more. And I know this is a little more Alabama heavy, and Florida fans probably don't want to hear it, but I imagine we've got a lot more Alabama fans watching us than Florida fans, given how things shook out. We have talked about this in the past, where if you're going into a top 10 matchup, which Alabama's about to go into 2 of them, if you're going into a top 10 matchup, you can have either, if you had to pick between either like a good, sound Notre Dame type defense or a less good defense that's more disruptive. Josh, you always say, assuming you have a high-powered offense, you'd rather have the more disruptive one than the all-around good one when facing another top-tier opponent. And that's something that I would love for you to unpack, maybe 2010, 2013 Auburn kind of thing. Alabama fans can remember that. I'd like for you to unpack that a little bit, because that's kind of where Alabama's headed right now. Talk about that and how you think it might relate to Alabama's defense.
The old school football way is that you make every play hard, every drive hard, and you play tight, you play press, and you're trying to make every yard a battle. The problem is when you do that, the more aggressive you are, the more you blitz, the more you play press coverage, the more opportunities you give people to beat you deep. And the thing that killed Alabama, I think, a couple times in this game is they did actually get beat deep. And that's what made this game close, right? It was the Surtain catch. It was like we talked about, Tony getting burning Malachi Moore. Branch happened the same thing where he kind of slipped. Those are the plays that sort of kept it close. But for the most part, in terms of scheme, in terms of strategy, one, I think like the Surtain thing, it is what it is. I think it was a bit of a fluke that he scores on that play. Maybe he catches it with his height, and you can't underestimate how much his size and height helped him there. Surtain's used to boxing people out in a way you can't do with somebody that's 6'4". Normally, he doesn't just get lost turning around and let the guy run by him. But if you try to press and all that, what's going to happen is you're just going to continually give up scores. And you have really 2 options there. You can either, 1, give up lots of quick scores, or 2, the more common way to do it is that you let the team slowly march you down the field to death. And Florida didn't give up any chunk plays. Arkansas didn't give up chunk plays to Alabama. What did they do? They gave up touchdowns on every drive slowly. Alabama ran, let me look at this number here, 83 offensive plays, officially passing and rushing. And Florida only ran 66. And that was lopsided. And it was also especially lopsided given how many drives Alabama actually managed to go down and score the field. What Auburn did in 2010, because they had a bad defense, is they said, look, we're going to score a lot. and we got this Fairley kid at nose guard. And what we're going to do is we're just going to think, okay, we're going to be super aggressive, and we're going to try to get a stop occasionally. And the reality is, 5 hard fought drives that all end in touchdowns, which is what Florida just allowed, is worse than 3 easy drives and 2 aggressive stops. And a lot of it in football today is built around the idea that you just need to get stops. Saban's talked about that. You know you're going to hemorrhage yards. And if you play man press, you're just going to get burned every time. So you can't, that whole option, that old school option's off the table. So instead you play bend but don't break, that Arkansas style of football, which is great when you're playing mediocre defenses because they struggle to act efficiently. But when you're playing a really, really good offense like Alabama and you play bend but don't break like Florida just did, you just slowly get killed. And the alternative, I will say, is if you play but don't break and you give up chunks, but you don't get beat over the top, you can eventually play defense in the red zone. Alabama tried to do this in the game. I will say a lot of this game came down to the fact that they shot themselves in the foot in red zone stops. Pitts makes a big play in the end zone. They get a fumble that they screw up, stuff like that. But the example of how to play effectively, I think, was just shown by Northwestern. Northwestern gave up 300 plus yards rushing. And if you see that number in an old game, in a traditional football game that's not a triple option team, you expect that you gave up 40 something points, right? But what Northwestern's shown, and we've talked about all year, is the best way to play defense is to just say, you know what? We're going to take away the pass. We're going to drop our linebackers. We're going to deal with whatever run you get. Hopefully you keep them to something like 6 to 8 yards per carry, which is what Florida sort of did with Alabama. And we're going to let you slowly march down the field without letting you get big chunk easy plays. And once we get in near the red zone, we're going to try to get a stop. Northwestern in the Ohio State game, Ohio State was 3 times in the red zone for 2 field goals and a turnover to start the game. And that's 6 points versus 21. And that's why that game ended up with 22 points versus 37 and feels very different. Both these teams kind of tried to do that. Alabama got burned over the top more. Florida tried to do it, and then Alabama was just way too efficient in the red zone. But regardless, I don't feel so bad about all this, and you've got to take away a lot of what you're thinking in terms of numbers. Florida made plays when they needed to make them in the red zone, and that's what really mattered. And then Alabama made about 3 critical errors defensively that gave Florida enough cheap points to keep it close.
I want to wrap this one up, but I do want to touch on one last thing. It's a little frustrating for me as a college football fan as it relates to Florida. And you might disagree with me. I'm going to give you an opportunity to wax poetic as well. I think Florida started prepping for Alabama weeks ago. And that to me is the only explanation as to why Florida lost to LSU. And to me, honestly, if Florida beats LSU, we're having a discussion today about why in the world do we have Notre Dame in the playoffs versus Florida? Because a 2-loss Florida, but to Alabama and A&M, has a legitimate argument because both lost neither one are conference champions. I'm incredibly frustrated that Florida dropped an inconceivable game to a bad LSU team, a very talented LSU team. But in my heart of hearts, the only explanation I have for this, after seeing what they did Saturday with Alabama, is and there's 2 things to this. One, if this is true, it's very good for Alabama because it's kind of the Ole Miss situation where we think that there was some knowledge there that was exploited. It's very good for Alabama because it means that they artificially faced a much harder task than they otherwise would have. But I think it also means that if they don't prep for Alabama weeks ago, that they beat LSU pretty easily. Clearly, they could have played Pitts. They took it lightly. They thought they were going to win. They thought they were going to dunk all over LSU, and they didn't. One, do you think that's the case? And 2, is that a good sign potentially for Alabama?
I do think it's the case. The biggest thing to me was that they held out a number of guys. It wasn't just Pitts. They had some guys that were banged up on defense that they held out as well. And the guys that they held out, you can't possibly tell me that they weren't spending that time watching Alabama. I mean, if they knew that they weren't going to play against LSU, why in the world wouldn't you? And I've heard chatter from Florida sources that there's a lot of speculation that they spent several weeks prepping for Alabama, or at least spending some time prepping for them when they thought this matchup was coming. Um, but I also totally agree with you that twofold. One, Alabama shouldn't feel quite as bad because Florida, um, there are a lot of little things you can prep for in a game, defensively and offensively, that probably were enough to sort of keep them in this. In a game that, be clear, they were down 35-17 at the half, and they had to claw their way back. And I think that may be the reason why, particularly, they won the third quarter and made this a game. But the other thing I will say is Florida would have been a heck of a lot better losing to LSU, or beating LSU rather, and losing by another 10 points. I don't know if they're in the playoff, but I think you feel a heck of a lot better at the end of the year if this was your second loss and not your third loss. That LSU loss was just a killer, and I think it was just irresponsible coaching, frankly. I mean, I get that Pitts is theoretically wasn't healthy. They're trying to get him; he's banged up. I saw zero indication that Pitts was actually so unhealthy that he couldn't play in that game. So, yep, I totally agree with
And
you.
what's interesting, Alabama fans, as we close this out, the way the seeding worked this year is opposite of 2018. I do think that Clemson also was able to prepare ahead for Alabama because they knew Notre Dame wasn't going to be that big of a threat, and they got really an extra week to prep for Alabama. Whereas this year, even though we have some concerns about Ohio State's performance against Northwestern, they're harder to prepare for than Notre Dame. So Alabama could theoretically do some of that, which they may not. But Notre Dame will have to put Clemson will have to put their full attention on Ohio State and won't have the luxury of prepping early for Alabama. So we'll see how that goes. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think about the Alabama defense. Are there some red flags? Is there a canary in the coal mine? Or are we giving them the benefit of the doubt based on the season as a whole? Tell us what you think. Watch our Alabama and Notre Dame preview that will also be coming out this week. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.